Hi, this is Larrabee, and I'll be presenting the title Academic Libraries and Toxic Leadership. So a quick overview of the title. It was about toxic leadership in academic libraries. I chose it because it was very specific to my profession. There were several chapters that defined and reviewed toxic leadership, specifically about the lack of current research, which I found very interesting. And then there was a review of all the current research about leadership in academic libraries in general, which is also pretty minimal, and then how toxic leadership really hasn't been addressed. The other sections of the book reviewed the impacts of toxic leadership and how to regain control of the library and heal after toxic leadership has been identified and removed. And then, of course, there were case studies at the very end, which gave us examples, some working examples of library situations and scenarios. So what is toxic leadership? The way it was described was in the context of larger destructive leadership phenomenon, which were the unethical, the abusive, neglectful or negligent, narcissistic, and then toxic. Examples of patterns of behavior were bullying, gaslighting or manipulating, intentional exclusion or isolation of employees, humiliation, belittling, and favoritism. The other thing that really stood out to me was the way that it was described as a pattern of behavior, regular behavior that a leader exhibited that created an environment in the workplace that was really toxic. And I was starting to think about our review of Confucius and the quote about ritual, which we had talked about in one of the discussion forums. And when Confucius is talking about sort of the process of ritual being how we reflect on our sense of identity and how we make our way through the world, if we are seeing ritual as a way to help us work through our world and see our identity and our place in that world as we become better ethical leaders, the ritual of toxicity is something that seems to have a negative impact on the benefit of that ritual. So repetitive behavior, positive or negative, can reinforce how we see ourselves in the world. And when it's toxic, we can begin to see ourselves as toxic or part of something that is toxic. And then on the flip side, that got me thinking that one of the things that leaders can do to either reduce or prevent toxic leadership or a toxic workplace is to tune into the power of positive rituals and allow the team to reflect on their value, express concerns in a healthy way, or build trust by achieving shared goals in some sort of regular ritualized practice. So like an end of the week decompression meeting where everybody has a chance to be heard and acknowledge, something that they did well in the week and something that they did poorly in the week or something they need help with. And just having that regular chance to feel heard or regular chance to feel like they have a voice could be an example of something that would increase that sort of ritual and avoid that toxic, or hopefully avoid that toxic work environment. So has toxic leadership in academic libraries been studied before? Not really. And so while other so-called feminized professions, such as nursing, have been studied in their tendency to create toxic leadership environments, thus far academic librarianship has not. And this was published in 2017. A quick search in the various indexes and bibliographic records has showed that there's not a lot since then as well. So there hasn't even really been much since 2017. So this was really fairly new work, and she did a really good job of doing a literature review, which included a lot of general management work. So of course she combined literature about libraries and library management with literature about toxic leadership. Ortega mentions that it was even more difficult to find articles that were dealing with toxic leadership in academic libraries, and the fact that the review found that terms for the research were ineffective or unethical leadership, not toxic. The articles discussed the values and ethics that were needed to be a leader to be effective, but that was usually addressed using a business ethics lens. So it was unusual to find articles and books that focused on academic librarianship, leadership, and ethics, because as I'll get into in a little bit, the nature of librarianship doesn't have the same ethical quandaries that the business world does. So it's understandable that there isn't a lot of work that specifically addresses the ethics of leadership, but that the terms used for toxic leadership were often ineffective and unethical. So thinking about how we use words and how we use terms and the importance of voice and linguistic executive presence, I started thinking about what the term toxic really brings to the table. And a lot of my work in this course has really been to pick apart words, to really think about terms, to be mindful of the words that we use. I found this really interesting, and it was reflecting on the Ethical Quest video that I had selected, the TED Talk about tone of voice and what if you want to sound like a leader, start by pronouncing your name and working on your tone and how you present your information verbally. And so I thought that the term toxic shifted the philosophical or managerial phenomenon, something akin to ethics or ineffective, to one that actually seems physical and palpable, even contagious, because it's toxic. We think of toxic waste, we think of contagiousness. To me, it brings a certain personal attachment to that level of destructive or negative energy to the workplace. And I kept thinking, would I rather be called unethical or toxic? So, getting into the specific ethical themes that we've addressed in the course, the first one, the deontological ethics, which I feel like wasn't really covered in the text, but I wanted to give a little bit of context for people outside of the library profession, that some of these some of these themes that we've addressed in the course are inherent through the library profession and through our work. And though not directly addressed in the book, there are connections that I wanted to make that help contextualize the book. The duty element was this noble librarian, this idea of this noble librarian, that is a very noble profession, and that we have the duty to enhance public literacy and engagement with the world, that librarians are champions of access to information, and we have professional standards and rules that really give us this professional sense of duty. You go into this profession knowing that it is, in some cases, really a calling, that there is something to uphold. Specifically, when it came to deontology and care ethics, the librarians feel a sense of duty to help students and faculty. That's our job, that's our mission. And we have a duty to create a safe space, nurturing environment, nurturing our environment for the development of thought. And that toxic leadership can create a negative environment for both the librarians and the students, and that librarians under toxic leadership aren't able to support students. This content also reminded me of the video we watched about the media having a duty of care and the need for responsible information seeking and contextualization, and as well as critical thinking. And again, this wasn't discussed specifically in the book that I'm reviewing, but as a profession, librarians have a duty to improve the public awareness of information. And in general, we tend to be very community oriented. We have a duty for care for our communities. We're protective about our space and the role within the institution. And we see ourselves as caretakers of knowledge and shepherds of thought. And we're compelled to do the right thing through professional obligation and dedication. The care ethics were a little bit easier to see and make connections within the book, mainly because of the focus on the interpersonal communication and team conflict. So, the fact that care ethics is focused on the sense of inherently nurturing and caring for people and making decisions based on what's best for people and taking care of them. And also that we're professional caretakers of the information and of people's process through the information. We're sort of taking people through information and taking care of people as they're exposed to information. That it's important to create that safe space for learning and self-improvement. I found this interesting too, because as I mentioned at the beginning, the library profession has been historically female dominated, and it's easiest to make the connections with care ethics because of its feminist undertones. The fact that we nurture self-improvement through the acquisition of knowledge, we help people improve themselves, is kind of inherent in the principles of care ethics. And again, the idea that making a comfortable, inviting space reinforces this perception of a feminization for the professions. Summarizing the work of Dee Garrison, who was writing in the 60s and 70s, one author comments that because libraries were seen as civilizing and nurturing, they were seen as acceptable places for women to work. This is from about the 1867 to 1905. This is where the title is covering. And additionally, the idea that libraries were centers of self-improvement and moral development meant that women were viewed as being especially suited for this missionary work, which I found very interesting. But specifically lacking in the librarian's professional service code are a sense of commitment and a drive to lead rather than to serve, and a clear-cut conception of the professional rights and responsibilities. The feminization of library work is the major cause of these deficiencies. So I think that the feminizing, or the sort of feminine sense that it's better to serve than lead is so pervasive in the profession, and that it's still evident today. So the other element which I had to step back about was talking about virtue ethics, that basically knowledge is good, that's inherent, that acquiring information improves character, being a good character and is how you can make good decisions in virtue ethics. If you're good, then you know how to make good decisions. And the more information and knowledge you acquire, the better you will be as a person, and therefore you will be able to make those decisions. And that self-awareness and critical thinking are essential occupational elements for librarianship, and that librarians are perceived as these temples of wisdom, which I put this down in a flippant kind of way because it's this perception of who we are. In a perfect world, leaders would just be inherently virtuous and know how to make the right decisions because of their character. They'd know how to navigate difficult situations, apply reason and emotion appropriately. And that I find virtue ethics to be a very aspirational framework, and it assumes that people in power will just have those leadership skills and characteristics that have brought them into the position. I did find an interesting paper about the virtue of reference, and the reference interaction is when a librarian is helping a student or a faculty member or public library patron find information and do research. And so this element requires the most amount of virtue, having to balance the teaching experience with the application of knowledge. So you're teaching somebody how to find information, not finding it for them. You have to understand not only where they're going, but how to get them there so that they can get there on their own. Reference work is neither an art nor a science. Its motivating virtue is indeed an intellectual virtue. Utilitarian ethic was also something that was focused both in the text, but also within the larger profession. The main point of utilitarianism was the idea that you're trying to make both the best decisions for the most number of people. And the point was toxic leaders tend to make decisions based on what's best for themselves. You need to set aside personal opinions and objectives to do that. So as my takeaways, the thing that I found the most interesting was that it's really important to take time for professional development work. It shouldn't be viewed as extra, but essential. Not only does it help you learn leadership skills, but it also gives you the time and the space to do that extra work in personal development, mindfulness. That toxic leadership can negatively impact the duty of academic libraries, the mission. It can really eat away at the foundation of the mission. Leadership requires a blend of personal and professional to gain trust, and you have to know yourself before you can be a good leader. And finally, that positive rituals can help strengthen a team's sense of value and identity, and that you can build in positive elements that can combat the toxic. And so that is my presentation. Here are some of the references that I used. I found this to be a really interesting book, and I feel like that was a really great experience to bring it in through the lens of librarianship in general, and also just in the realm of sort of the good and the bad of leadership qualities.